The founding of Ravenscraftoft Manor, 1647. In the damp, windswept hills of northern England, a manor rose from scorched earth and ash. Ravenscraftoft, as it would come to be known, began not as a place of wealth or welcome, but of whispered rumours and scorched foundations. The year was 1647, and the man at its helm was Ambrose Fenwick, a minor nobleman with ambitions that far outpaced his title. History remembers him as a rationalist, a man of science in a superstitious age, but it forgets the cost of his disbelief. The land he purchased was acquired for a fraction of its value, largely due to the unfortunate demise of its previous owners, the Blackwood family. Official records list the cause as accidental fire, tragic but not uncommon for the time. Yet locals whispered a darker version. All 7 members of the Blackwood family had perished, their bodies untouched by flame, yet found in postures of unnatural agony, their mouth sewn shut with soot-black thread. Just weeks later, Ambrose purchased the land. He called it an opportunity. Others called it a mistake. The grounds themselves bore a haunted reputation long before the Blackwoods. Shepherds avoided its borders. Children were warned never to stray past the stone well at its eastern edge. Old tales spoke of the land being once sacred a site for pagan rites, so old that even druids dared not speak the names of the entities worshipped there. Locals called it a thin place, a veil between worlds worn so threadbare that wind carried whispers instead of leaves. Ambrose dismissed these stories as peasant nonsense. He built Ravenscraftoft stone by stone, a manor of impressive size and harsh geometry, as if attempting to impose order on the land itself. And when his young wife Eleanor questioned the property's past, he merely laughed and told her that ghosts could not survive the scrutiny of reason. But even in those early days, something was watching, something that had not burned with the Blackwoods, something that had merely gone quiet, waiting for the right kind of blood. Eleanor's nightmares and the marked twins. From the very first night at Ravenscraftoft, Eleanor Fenwick sensed she was not alone. Not in the usual domestic sense, Ambrose was often away on business, but in the deeper, more disquieting way that a person feels when silence is filled with something breathing. At first it was subtle, the soft patter of feet when no one was walking, cold draughts that moved against the wind. But then the whispers began. She described them as murmurs through the walls, faint, genderless, incomprehensible, yet urgent. They never spoke words she could understand, only tones that seemed mournful, sometimes mocking. Her sleep became a battleground. Night after night, Eleanor was tormented by visions of children, dozens, perhaps hundreds, none of whom she recognized, but all of whom she felt responsible for. In these dreams, they suffered. Some drowned, others burned, some vanished into folds of shadow that pulsed like lungs. And always watching, always looming behind them was a shapeless figure, cloaked in a writhing mass of darkness. It had no face, only presence. Unable to bear the growing dread alone, Eleanor began to record her experiences in meticulous journals. These entries, which would later become the most detailed primary source on the Fenwick curse, read like the descent of a rational woman into inherited madness. One entry reads, "I saw them all tonight. Children I've not yet born and their children after them. All marked, all condemned. And behind them something waits patient and hungering, whispering names I have not yet chosen." Within a year, Eleanor gave birth to twins Edmund and Margaret. The delivery was brutal. The midwife, a hardened woman with 2 decades of experience, went pale upon seeing the birthmarks at the base of the children's necks. Crescent-shaped, perfectly symmetrical. The marks seemed to shift in darkness, waxing and waning with moonlight. Ambrose was unbothered calling them curiosities of genetics. But Eleanor knew better. From the moment they opened their eyes, the twins behaved differently. They cried at odd intervals, laughed in silence, and often stared at corners of the room with solemn recognition, as though seeing someone else there. They were bound to each other beyond sibling closeness. They spoke in a language no one could decipher, not even Eleanor, but they understood each other. And perhaps more disturbingly, they understood the whispers. The death in the well. The tragedy that would come to define the beginning of the Fenwick curse occurred on the twins' 7th birthday. It had been a mild spring afternoon, and Ravenscraftoft was filled with the artificial joy of servants instructed to appear celebratory. Eleanor, by now worn thin by years of spiritual siege, watched the children closely. But even her vigilance proved insufficient. Sometime between the midday cake and the evening games, young Margaret vanished. One moment she was playing by the orchard's edge. The next she was gone. A frantic search ensued. The grounds were combed, the woods scoured, even the attics and root cellars opened. Nothing. Not until the 3rd night, when Edmund, pale and glassy-eyed, awoke screaming, "She's in the well. She's calling me." The old stone well at the eastern edge of the property had been sealed long before the Fenwicks arrived. Heavy, cracked with age, and covered by a capstone too weighty for any child to move. But when Ambrose and the servants arrived, the lid had been slid aside impossibly. They peered into the abyss and saw Margaret lying at the bottom, eyes wide mouth open, in what appeared to be a silent scream. But there were no signs of drowning. Her lungs were dry. Her body, cold yet unblemished, showed no signs of decomposition despite being submerged for 3 days. The most disturbing detail was the object clutched tightly in her hand, a small hand-carved figurine. Its form was alien, hunched with too many limbs and ridged tentacles that curled from its back like claws of smoke. No one recognized it. No one wanted to. Thaddeus Cooper, the local constable, was shaken. His report would later read, "This child's death bears no natural explanation. The seal was unbroken. The idol she clutched, I've seen its like only once before in a book of forbidden rites, written by hands that should have burned." He ended the report with a single line scrawled in a shaky hand. "God help the Fenwicks, for no one else can." From that moment on, the household was never the same. Ravenscraftoft grew colder. Eleanor began sleeping during the day and pacing through the halls at night. Edmund, now an only child, sat in silence for hours, whispering to someone only he could see. And the well sealed once more seemed to hum in the moonlight. Something had come through, or perhaps something had taken what was offered and wanted more. Madness and the first collapse. Margaret's death fractured the Fenwick household like a mirror, struck at its core, shards of sanity scattered and inverted too sharp to reassemble. Eleanor already unraveling under the weight of her dreams, and whispering walls sank into near catatonic silence by day and compulsive activity by night. She filled pages upon pages of her journal with looping symbols and phrases in dead languages she had no memory of learning. Sometimes the servants found her standing motionless before the nursery mirror, lips moving without sound, eyes wet but unfocused. Ambrose, once the confident master of logic, now fled the manor at every opportunity. His business trips lengthened and his letters home grew vague. He refused to discuss Margaret, dismissing all questions with the brittle insistence of a man trying to glue the world back together with denial. When he did return, he drank heavily, spoke to no one, and slept fitfully, muttering names that Eleanor had dreamed years before. But it was Edmund who changed the most. The vibrant, curious boy who once mimicked bird calls and laughed at clouds now barely spoke. He refused to leave his room during daylight hours, drawing the curtains and hissing when the sunlight touched his skin. "They hurt when it shines," he explained once to a maid. "And when they hurt, they make me hurt too." He spoke only to Eleanor, and even then his voice sometimes shifted, growing higher, softer almost, familiar. The servants whispered that he sounded like Margaret. More than once they overheard him relaying messages from the other side, recounting events he could not have known: the death of a villager's horse, the sudden illness of a neighboring farmer's wife. Eleanor never questioned the truth of his visions. Instead, she wrote them down. The household was already fraying when the second tragedy struck. 2 years after Margaret's death, a strange illness swept through the manor. It began with nausea, then progressed to an aversion to light so extreme that candles had to be extinguished during meals. Servants collapsed in fits of trembling madness, clawing at their own skin. And then, one by one, they simply stopped. Not dead in the traditional sense, no heart failure, no trauma, but absent. Their bodies intact, their organs functional but empty. The village doctor called it catatonic fever. The midwife called it possession. 5 servants died within a week. Those who survived fled. Only Ambrose, Eleanor, and Edmund remained at Ravenscraftoft. And by then the manor was no longer just a home. It was something else. Something waiting. The door, ritual. The man who had laughed at superstition now found himself thumbing through books bound in human skin. In the wake of the servants' deaths, Ambrose finally acknowledged what Eleanor had understood from the start. Something was wrong with the land, something ancient, patient, and hungry. Desperate, he dove into the past, poring over local folklore, ecclesiastical records, and occult manuscripts. It was then that he stumbled upon mentions of the Keepers of the Veil, a forgotten sect of pagan mystics who believed certain geographic locations served as doorways between worlds' points where reality frayed and interdimensional predators could peer through. One such place was Ravenscraftoft. The keepers had not built their shrines to worship these entities, but to contain them. Rituals performed seasonally and most intensely on the winter solstice kept the veil intact. Blood rites that required precise symbols, lunar alignments, and sacrifice. The Blackwoods Ambrose discovered had not perished in a fire. They had failed in their duty, and the consequence was annihilation. Ambrose was no longer a skeptic. He was a man racing against a door he had unknowingly helped unlock. But he would not repeat the Blackwoods crimes. He vowed not to sacrifice innocence. Instead, he offered himself and with him those who shared his blood. On the winter solstice of 1656, Ambrose enacted a ritual of his own devising. It was a blend of keeper rites and the scientific method scrawled with equations that intersected with pentagrams, circles, and language that seemed older than breath. Eleanor and Edmund participated willingly. In the cellar beneath Ravenscraftoft, directly over what the keepers once called the mouth beneath, they lit the candles, drew the symbols, and spoke the invocations. Only Ambrose did not return. They found his body the next morning curled into the center of a blood-drawn glyph. Eyes open mouth, smiling. Burned into the stone beneath him were the crescent marks that had once darkened his children's necks. But these did not fade with the phases of the moon. Eleanor wrote that night, "The door is closed, but not locked. Ambrose has bought us time, but the shadow has tasted our blood. It remembers." And so began the age of hiding. 3 branches, James Thomas and Anne Eleanor, did not wait for the next sign. With Ambrose dead and Ravenscraftoft pulsing with silent menace, she and Edmund fled south. They changed their names to Fletcher and posed as distant relatives of a shipping merchant. In London, they lived modestly but purposefully, poring over Ambrose's research and expanding it with their own. Edmund, still haunted but strangely attuned, became a vital source of insight, his dreams acting as a barometer for the entity's awareness. When Edmund married a quiet woman named Sarah Collins, Eleanor allowed herself a fragile hope. They had 3 children, James Thomas and Anne. And for a time all seemed well. None bore the crescent birthmark. No nightmares. No whispers. Eleanor dared to believe the curse had died with Ambrose's blood on the stone. She was wrong. On James's 18th birthday, the dreams returned. He awoke screaming, drenched in sweat, babbling names he could not have known. "I saw them," he said. "All of them, all dead, all watched." Eleanor knew then the entity had not been destroyed, only delayed, perhaps even enraged by Ambrose's defiance. Her decision came quickly. The Fenwick bloodline would scatter so far and so wide that its taste would dilute into nothingness. James was sent to the American colonies, given a new surname and a sealed letter to open on his 30th birthday. Thomas was sent to France under the name Fontaine, and to Scotland, where the church might offer protection. Eleanor remained behind, tending to Edmund and compiling the family's collected knowledge into a single volume, The Fenwick Legacy, a grimoire of symbols, rituals, warnings and instructions, a survival manual for future descendants who might awaken one day to find their blood singing with whispers. Before she died, she wrote one last instruction in her own hand: never gather, never return, and never, ever listen too closely. The American line, James Foster, James Fenwick, now James Foster, arrived in the Massachusetts Bay Colony under a heavy cloak of false identity and reluctant destiny. At just 19, he possessed the mannerisms of an old man, wary eyes, sleepless nights, and a quiet dread that he dared not name. Eleanor had told him nothing of the bloodline's truth, only that he would understand when the time came. That time arrived on his 30th birthday when he opened the sealed letter she had entrusted to him. Inside was a confession, a warning, and a key, both metaphorical and literal. The key was to a hidden compartment beneath his floorboards, where a copy of the Fenwick Legacy awaited. James read the entire book in a single sleepless night. The next morning, he fainted. He spent the next years quietly rebuilding himself, not just as a man, but as a guardian. He took 2 wives over time, both unaware of his true lineage, and fathered 6 children. To shield them, he withheld the legacy until each reached the age of 30. Only then were they allowed to read the grimoire, to understand what pulsed beneath their veins. Despite these precautions, the curse persisted. Every 3rd generation, a child would be born with the mark, the crescent sliver at the base of the neck. These children never lived long. Some died of illness, others in accidents so improbable they defied statistical explanation. One case still chills the descendants today: Eliza Foster, born in 1743, a quiet girl with large eyes and a habit of standing perfectly still for hours. She was 7 years old when she was found drowned, face down, in a puddle scarcely an inch deep. The woman who found her, a nursemaid named Abigail, claimed the puddle had reflected not the cloudy New England sky, but something else. A place made of impossible colors, she said. It bent light wrong. I saw angles that shouldn't exist. Eliza's death marked the start of a pattern. Water mirrors, reflective surfaces all seemed to serve as doorways, however briefly, between this world and the one that watched. James noted in his journal, "It is not random, it is ritual. Every death opens a slit. The bloodline is being bled one drop at a time." The American branch, while geographically distant from Ravenscraftoft, had not escaped its gravity. They had only bought time. And time, as they would all learn, was something the whispering ones understood far too well. The French line, Thomas Fontaine. Thomas Fenwick, reborn as Thomas Fontaine, arrived in France just as the Enlightenment flickered into being. He found sanctuary among thinkers, skeptics, and scientists, men who believed the universe could be measured, dissected, understood. He embraced this rationalism with the zeal of a drowning man grasping for driftwood. If the curse was real, he reasoned, then it must be quantifiable. If it had rules, it could be broken. He married into the minor aristocracy and used his influence to quietly research the phenomena detailed in the Fenwick legacy. His children were raised not in fear but in cold inquiry. They catalogued every dream, every death, every whisper. 100 years of meticulous records were kept annotated in both French and Latin, stored in iron-locked chests beneath the family estate in Normandy. Their scientific approach brought a false sense of control until history intervened. During the French Revolution, the Fontaine family's connection to the aristocracy became a death sentence. Most were executed in the Terror, their research lost to fire and confiscation. Only one survived, Marguerite Fontaine, a young widow who fled across the Channel with her infant son. In a cruel twist of fate, she unknowingly settled in a village just 10 miles from Ravenscraftoft. The effects were immediate. Within a fortnight of her arrival, local children began experiencing vivid nightmares, visions of a tall, angular figure watching them through windows and whispering their names. Cattle were found mutilated, their blood drained through crescent-shaped wounds. Margaret's health deteriorated rapidly. Villagers noted her hair graying overnight, her skin tightening like parchment, her eyes sunken but lucid, terrifyingly so. When the local historian traced her lineage and made the connection to the long-abandoned Ravenscraftoft estate, panic took root. Margaret was found dead a week later in her cottage, twisted into an anatomically impossible posture. Her mouth and eyes were sewn shut with a thread blacker than coal, one that could not be burned, cut, or chemically analyzed. No tool could pierce it. It repelled all attempts. The French line's rationalism had failed them. The curse, it seemed, could not be measured, only feared. The Scottish line, Anne Fraser. Anne Fenwick became Anne Fraser and walked a different path, entirely one of faith. She sought refuge in the Scottish Highlands, where belief in demons and angels still permeated even the stone. There she entered a small Christian order and took her vows, hoping that proximity to God might provide some distance from the darkness clawing at her lineage. Her descendants embraced the church fully. Many became priests, ministers, scribes. They believed that the curse was not merely an interdimensional parasite, but a spiritual test, an affliction placed upon them to prove their devotion. Their records are among the most detailed, blending theological reflection with grim practical experience. One such record, written by Reverend Malcolm Fraser in 1802, recounts his personal encounter. "It came to me in the form of my sister dead these 10 years. She spoke with her voice, remembered our childhood games, our songs. But her eyes, they were black windows staring into a void so profound, I wept without knowing why. She asked me to gather the family, said we must return to the house. Home, she called it, but I knew she lied. Malcolm recited the protective verses his grandmother had taught him, words passed from Eleanor's original grimoire. As he spoke, the figure twisted and melted, revealing something beneath a writhing, asymmetrical form, with too many joints and not enough humanity. It retreated, but not before whispering, 'Your faith will fail. When it does, we will return.' The Scottish branch clung to ritual. Every full moon they performed blessings, exorcisms, vigils. They never gathered. They never discussed Ravenscraftoft. And yet, despite their efforts, deaths still occurred quietly, cryptically, with no natural cause. But the Frasers believed, and belief they hoped would be enough. Rituals of survival. For generations, the scattered descendants of Eleanor Fenwick lived by one unbreakable commandment: never gather, never return, never speak too loudly of the blood. But warnings fade. Rituals become folklore. And over time, protection becomes optional. Still, the most cautious branches, particularly those directly descended from Edmund, took the legacy seriously. Their lives became dictated by a rhythm older than memory, governed not by seasons, but by lunar phases and dream signs. Copies of the Fenwick legacy, often disguised in ordinary covers or translated into obscure dialects, were passed down with sacred urgency. These texts detailed a strict code of conduct, an evolving rule book for surviving what could not be banished. 3 key precautions emerged as universally followed among the descendants. 1. Never allow multiple Fenwick descendants to live under the same roof. It became clear that proximity bred intensity. When more than one bearer of the bloodline lived together, phenomena increased exponentially, objects moving mirrors, clouding animals behaving erratically. In some cases, entire households vanished overnight. One journal describes a family of 4 siblings and a grandmother who gathered for a holiday meal and were never seen again. The house remained untouched. Plates still on the table. Food still warm. 2. Perform a cleansing ritual on every full moon. The full moon, while calming for some mystical traditions, seemed to act as a mirror, reflecting and amplifying the entity's presence. The ritual required iron shavings, salt circles, and recitations from Eleanor's original script. Done correctly, it silenced the whispers for several weeks. Done poorly, it called them closer. 3. Never return to Ravenscraftoft. This was the most sacred of all rules. The land was not just haunted, it was a wound. The ancestral home still sat atop something open, something unfinished. Even approaching its grounds had been linked to mental collapse, sudden bleeding, and birthmarks returning in the elderly. It wasn't just the source, it was the mouth. And it was always hungry. As generations passed, these rituals were maintained more through superstition than understanding. Many descendants followed the rules without knowing why families where no two cousins could share a bedroom or where a special salt was always thrown in the fire on Thursdays. The meanings behind these traditions blurred, but the effects remained. Those who followed the protocols lived longer. Those who mocked them didn't. But the most dangerous development came with the advent of modernity disbelief. As science pushed further into the unknown, the stories of the Fenwicks were rewritten as metaphor mental illness or hereditary delusion. Many descendants cast off the rituals as backward nonsense. They ignored the warnings, and one man in particular forgot the most important rule of all. He returned to Ravenscraftoft. Howard Phillips and the Restoration. In 1897, Howard Phillips, a successful industrialist and amateur genealogist, purchased a derelict estate in northern England. He called it a restoration project, a quaint summer retreat for the smoke-choked streets of Manchester. What he didn't know, what no one had told him, was that through his mother's side he carried the blood of James Foster, formerly James Fenwick. Ravenscraftoft had stood empty for over 2 centuries, its walls sinking into ivy and rot, its name purged from most records. But Howard found it listed in a local surveyor's registry and was instantly drawn to it. He claimed the land gave him a sense of familiarity, though he'd never been north of Yorkshire in his life. Construction began immediately, and so did the accidents. Tools vanished and reappeared arranged in symbols that no worker recognized. 3 laborers fell from scaffolding without witnesses or warning. A 4th gouged out his own eyes in the cellar after breaking through a sealed wall. He survived long enough to scream, "The geometry is wrong, it bends inward." Phillips pressed on, dismissing the incidents as bad luck. But his dreams began to darken. He saw a girl standing by a well. Her mouth opened in a scream he couldn't hear. He saw crescent moons overlaid on blueprints. He saw doors that opened into places that couldn't physically exist. Worst of all, he heard voices in his study at night, whispers in a dialect he'd never heard, but somehow understood. The restoration completed in late autumn. Against the advice of nearly everyone, Howard moved his wife Catherine and their 6-year-old twins Elliot and Evelyn into the east wing of the manor. Within days, the children began drawing strange shapes on the walls. Spirals inside spirals, eyes without pupils, mouths without faces. They asked about the girl in the well even though no one had told them about Margaret. They began talking to the walls. Then came the winter solstice. The family vanished. Not murdered, not kidnapped, just gone. Their clothes remained. Their beds were made. The food in the kitchen had gone cold, but untouched. The only evidence was a journal found in Howard's study. The final entry read, "They're coming through now." The door was never fully closed. And I was the key. The vanishing. The disappearance of the Phillips family gripped England like a fever. Newspapers speculated about cult activity, insurance fraud, even mass suicide. No bodies were recovered. No signs of struggle were found. And yet every local who lived near the estate refused to go near it, even the constables. When the investigation turned up, nothing, the case went cold. The government quietly declared the area off-limits due to unstable geological conditions. In truth, officials were frightened by the testimonies of search teams who had entered the manor and emerged dazed, weeping, or in one case, permanently blind. No one would speak about what they saw. Ravenscraftoft was sealed again, bricked up, bolted down, erased from maps. But the damage had already been done. By returning to the manor by activating the bloodline's origin, Howard Phillips had undone Eleanor's greatest protection, the scattering. The entity that had whispered for centuries in shadows now had a voice, and it had fed. Over the next 5 years, the scattered one's descendants of Eleanor's 3 branches who still followed the legacy reported a sudden rise in symptoms. Nightmares, hallucinations, children speaking in tongues, mirrors refusing to show reflections. Even those who had long abandoned the rituals felt it. Something had shifted. Something was growing stronger. And worst of all, it remembered every name. Global awakening. After the Ravenscraftoft incident, the curse that had once moved slowly, cautiously, now surged like a flood. The entity was no longer whispering through bloodlines hidden across continents. It was calling them loudly and simultaneously. By 1898, scattered Fenwick descendants began experiencing identical symptoms across the globe: terrifying dreams, sudden dread in moonlight, and hallucinations that bent physical reality. In Massachusetts, a teacher named Eleanor Mason awoke each night at precisely 3:17 a.m. with a taste of salt and iron in her mouth and her body covered in crescent-shaped bruises that vanished by dawn. In Brittany, France, a boy was hospitalized after carving spirals into his own arms while muttering, "She walks the hall again and the door is nearly open." In the Scottish Highlands, Reverend Alistair Fraser collapsed mid-sermon while screaming in a voice not his own, warning his congregation of the hollow beneath the well. But most of the afflicted had no idea they shared a bloodline. Generations had passed since Eleanor scattered her descendants. Many bore different surnames. Some didn't even know their true family origins, which meant that when the entity began feeding again, more actively, more aggressively, its victims were alone, isolated, vulnerable. Those who sought help were misdiagnosed with schizophrenia, epilepsy, or sleep disorders. Some were institutionalized. Others took their own lives, and yet, not all were lost. Among the few who recognized what was happening was Elizabeth Blackwood, a professor of folklore at Miskatonic University in Massachusetts. Her research had long focused on generational curses and mythic trauma, and through a combination of scholarly diligence and inherited intuition, she pieced together what others could not. She was a descendant of both the Blackwood family, the original owners of Ravenscraftoft, and the Scottish Fraser line. Her grandmother, a hard-eyed woman who never spoke of her childhood, had once told her, "If you dream of the crescent, write it down. If you hear your name when no one's speaking, run." Elizabeth did not run. She listened, and in doing so, she became the first in decades to hear the entity, not just as predator, but as pattern. The rise of the scattered ones. Elizabeth Blackwood's research evolved from curiosity to obsession. She combed archives, studied obituaries, tracked strange cases of unexplainable death and madness, all pointing toward a singular, terrible origin. Ravenscraftoft. The further she dug, the clearer the picture became. And when she matched a cluster of recent disappearances with surnames linked to the Fenwick legacy, she knew what she had to do. Using university grants and her own resources, she constructed an intercontinental family tree of all known Fenwick descendants. The task took years. It spanned continents, broken genealogies, and falsified documents. She called the network the Scattered Ones, reviving Eleanor's vision of a fragmented bloodline now armed with knowledge. Her research unearthed something even more chilling. The curse was accelerating. It no longer waited generations to strike. Instead, It seemed to be activating multiple descendants at once, pulling them toward a collective reckoning. In one of her journal entries, Elizabeth wrote, "This is no longer a haunting. It's a maturation. The entity is evolving, and it's pushing the bloodline toward something." Elizabeth published a paper in a little-known journal of comparative mythology titled Inherited Predation and Mythoparasitism in European Folklore. Buried within the dry academic prose was a line that still sends chills down the spine of any descendant who reads it. Entities such as the Fenwick predator appear not to destroy their hosts outright, but to reshape them over time, culminating in a final harvest. Some families laughed her off, but others didn't. A group began to form quiet at first, then coordinated. They called themselves the Scattered Ones, just as she had named them. And through shared letters, encoded messages, and later encrypted online forums, they began comparing symptoms, identifying triggers, and rediscovering the old rituals Eleanor had once devised. It wasn't salvation, but it was something. And for a time, it worked. The Ravenscraftoft Expedition. In 1912, Elizabeth Blackwood did something many in the Scattered Ones begged her not to do. She returned to Ravenscraftoft. Her reasoning was simple, if dangerously optimistic. If the curse began there, she argued, perhaps the key to ending it lies there too. Armed with old maps, protective tools crafted of iron and salt, and 3 fellow descendants, each bearing a crescent mark, she made the journey north. They documented everything. Their recordings, photographs, and sketches would later be recovered and archived under lock and key by the ghastly journal. The footage ends abruptly just outside the old well, but the notes written hastily in Elizabeth's hand reveal the escalating horror. We hear them now, beneath us. Not whispers, not anymore. A voice, unified, hungry. The well was no longer just a landmark. It was changing. Warped geometries surrounded it. The stone circle pulsed as if breathing. Tools malfunctioned. Cameras recorded footage that played backward or displayed places not seen with the eye. Time seemed unreliable. Watches stopped or looped. One man, Jonathan Pierce, insisted he had been here before, though he had never left Canada. Then, silence. 3 vanished. Only Pierce returned, wandering the moors weeks later, hair, white eyes wild, and blood dried under his fingernails. He was committed shortly after, but before slipping into permanent psychosis, he whispered something to his sister, the door. "It's not a door anymore, it's a mouth. And it's so hungry." Elizabeth was never seen again. The Scattered Ones fractured after her loss. Some fell into despair. Others redoubled their efforts. But the rules had changed. The entity was no longer bound to the past. It was moving forward quickly, and it was starting to choose. The modern era. Throughout the early to mid-20th century, the Fenwick curse adapted to a changing world, no longer manifesting solely through nightmares and shadows, but weaving itself into history itself. Wars, plagues, and societal upheaval offered the perfect camouflage for its escalation, and the Scattered Ones began to notice a terrible pattern. Fenwick blood spilled most easily during moments of mass chaos. During the First World War, descendants of the bloodline who had enlisted met bizarre and grisly ends, not from gunfire or shell blasts, but from inexplicable training accidents and mysterious illnesses. In one documented case, a soldier was found dead in a trench with no visible wounds, his face contorted in a frozen scream, and his dog tags fused into his skin. His journal, recovered from his chest pocket, contained only one entry dated a week before his death. She walks the field at dusk, and the sky forgets its shape. In World War II, the same pattern repeated. A nurse stationed in Normandy, unbeknownst to her, descended from the French Fontaine branch, was found catatonic after wandering into a field hospital mirror tent. Witnesses said she began talking in two voices, one hers, the other, deep guttural, and in a language no one could place. She died within hours, her tongue bitten off. The medical report cited trauma-induced psychosis, but the scattered ones knew better. Then came the Great Depression, and with it, a spike in suicides among Fenwick descendants. Dozens left behind identical notes. The whispering ones say this is the only way. These deaths occurred in multiple countries across cultural and linguistic boundaries, but the phrasing never changed. Something had become synchronized, an intelligence coordinating across generations. With the rise of psychology and psychiatry, many afflicted were institutionalized rather than buried. Diagnoses included dissociative identity disorder, auditory hallucinations, and hereditary schizophrenia. But these labels only masked the truth. The curse had evolved into a mimicry of mental illness. And worse, it was learning to hide. The digital grimoire. By the 1980s, a new generation of scattered ones emerged, this time armed not with grimoires and salt, but with data. One of the most influential among them was Richard Henderson, a software engineer in Seattle and distant descendant of James Foster. Unlike his ancestors, Richard didn't believe in curses, at least not at first. But a series of personal tragedies, including the sudden, unexplainable deaths of his sister and daughter, both marked, forced him to confront the pattern. Unable to find answers in religion or medicine, Richard turned to algorithms. He created a program that cross-referenced global death records, psychiatric institutionalizations, and certain genetic markers tied to the Fenwick lineage. The results were chilling. Clusters of unexplained deaths appeared every 27 years, always aligning with lunar eclipses or winter solstices. Even more disturbing, these clusters corresponded with locations where known descendants were living, many unaware of their ancestry. Richard's daughter, Julia Henderson, expanded on his work after his death. A programmer and geneticist, she developed the Grimoire Protocol, a secure online system for verified descendants to report symptoms, compare experiences, and preserve ritual knowledge. For the first time in centuries, the scattered bloodline could communicate in real time. Through this digital network, they confirmed old protections still worked: salt rings, full moon rituals, and isolation of marked children from reflective surfaces. But they also discovered new truths. For instance, the entity was weakest during solar flares, and silver-lined clothing reduced auditory hallucinations. Julia even identified a genetic anomaly in descendants with strong resistance to the entity, a mutation possibly introduced by Ambrose's ritual centuries earlier. They weren't winning, but they were surviving longer, and survival for the Fenwicks had always been the first miracle. Maya Chen and the Spiral Phenomenon. Among the most influential modern voices in the network was Maya Chen, a novelist living in Singapore. Her grandmother, quiet, devout, and prone to staring at water for hours, had died whispering a word no one could translate: Halthran. It wasn't until Maya turned 29 and began experiencing the recurring dreams, crescent moons, spiraling architecture, a well she'd never seen but could describe in full, that she realized her grandmother had protected her from something ancient. Her first manifestation began subtly. She would wake to find her furniture rearranged into perfect geometries, triangles pointing east chairs, always in groups of 5, her bed circled in salt she had no memory of placing. Then her computer began turning on at night, displaying glyphs in an alphabet she didn't know but instinctively understood. She documented everything and uploaded it to Julia Henderson's network. Other descendants soon reported the same phenomena. But one detail stood out: each arrangement of objects formed a spiral, sometimes clockwise, sometimes reversed. The direction seemed to matter. Clockwise spirals calmed dreams. Counterclockwise ones summoned them. In one particularly terrifying event, Maya woke in her bathtub with no memory of how she got there. The walls around her painted in wet handprints, none of them her size. Her laptop screen displayed a message: "Gather them. The blood must reunite. We will offer knowledge in exchange." The scattered ones debated what this meant. Was it a trap, or was the entity negotiating? It was Maya who first proposed a radical theory that the entity was not just a predator, but a messenger, that perhaps the dreams weren't warnings but instructions. She began advocating for controlled experiments, dreams recorded, ritual variations tested, and above all, a deeper listening to the voices in the dark. Some called her reckless, but others began to listen. The retreat trap. In 2010, an anonymous benefactor launched what appeared to be a benign scientific endeavor, a global genealogical study targeting people with rare undiagnosed genetic markers. Participants were promised free full-spectrum DNA sequencing, an exclusive wellness retreat in the English countryside, and lifetime access to ancestry databases. For most, it sounded like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. But for Julia Henderson, it set off every alarm. The markers listed in the promotional materials corresponded exactly to the ones Julia had flagged in her grimoire protocol as unique to the Fenwick bloodline. Even more alarming was the location of the retreat, though unnamed in advertisements. Her contacts in the UK confirmed it was Ravenscraftoft, now quietly restored and repurposed under a corporate shell. Julia and the scattered ones mobilized. They launched a counter-campaign using fake news stories about fraud and cult involvement, flagged the program with international agencies, and issued encrypted alerts to all members of their network. They begged participants to reconsider, to ask questions, to demand proof. It wasn't enough. 17 people accepted the invitation. None returned. What followed was chaos. Local authorities declared the event a mass suicide, though no bodies were ever recovered. The manor once again burned to the ground, its foundation melted, a detail fire marshals refused to comment on. Ground-penetrating radar scans revealed something that had never been documented before: a perfect circular void beneath the former cellar. 30 feet wide, blacker than stone, unreachable. 3 different drilling companies were contracted to investigate. All 3 quit within days. The official reason: nightmares. Voices, personnel refusing to return to the site. The scattered ones, gutted by the loss, regrouped in grief and fear. For many, it was confirmation that the entity had feasted again, and worse, had learned. The trap had been clever, digital, coordinated, anonymous, and for several years afterward. The whispering stopped. The door had opened just enough. The marked children. From 2011 onward, something changed in the bloodline, not in the dreams or the mirrors, but in births. Around the world, Fenwick descendants, who had long ago vowed never to have children, began reporting unexpected pregnancies. Some described overwhelming biological urges, a compulsion to reproduce so strong it overrode previous convictions, medical diagnoses, even sterilization procedures. A woman in Toronto with a failed IVF history suddenly conceived naturally. A man in Kyoto, previously infertile, fathered twins. And nearly all these children were born with the crescent-shaped birthmark. It was the first time in recorded history that dozens, perhaps hundreds, of marked children existed simultaneously. Dr. Elias Norton, a geneticist and Fenwick descendant, obtained tissue samples and began analyzing their DNA. What he found defied science. Segments of the children's genomes did not match either parent. These weren't simple mutations. They were foreign structures, base pair arrangements that appeared nowhere else in the human genome. And some of them weren't even organic. In a classified report sent to Julia Henderson's network, Dr. Norton wrote, "Something is rewriting the blueprint of the Fenwick bloodline at a molecular level. These children are not entirely human, not anymore. They are being built, grown, modified." Worse still, the children were showing signs of extraordinary abilities before age 10. Some communicated telepathically with each other. Others manipulated electrical devices, TVs flickering on at command computers operating without keyboards. One child in Lisbon caused the temperature of his room to drop by 30 degrees in under a minute while having a nightmare. The scattered ones were divided. Some saw the children as an evolution, the next phase in the Fenwick legacy. Others feared they were vessels crafted not for survival, but for invasion, because if the entity was no longer feeding, was it breeding a house? Divided the three factions. By 2015, the scattered ones had splintered into three ideological factions, each with its own belief about what the bloodline had become and what should be done. The Severance faction, led by a descendant of the Fontaine line, this group advocated for extreme solutions, forced sterilization, exile, and even euthanasia of marked children. To them, the entity's influence was irreversible, its agenda catastrophic. They believed that complete extinction of the Fenwick bloodline was the only way to sever the connection. Though largely operating underground, their members included powerful medical and governmental figures. They viewed the birth of the marked children not as a miracle, but as a countdown. The Restorationists. This faction returned to Eleanor's original vision. They sought to refine the old rituals, uncover hidden passages in the grimoires, and perform protective rites with greater precision. They believed that the connection could be cleansed, not destroyed. Restorationists built sanctuaries for marked children, offering isolation and shielding, often in remote places. They believed in preservation, in containment, in buying time until a more permanent solution could be found. The Communionists, the most controversial group led by Maya Chen, believed that the entity was not a parasite, but a mentor. They claimed the dreams had shifted, becoming more coherent, compassionate, even instructional. They began to treat the marked children as bridges vessels, capable of translating between two realities. Their meetings became rituals of listening where children were encouraged to speak aloud the messages whispered in their sleep. To the others, the Communionists were cultists. To themselves, they were pioneers of transcendence. This divide, spiritual, philosophical, and deeply emotional, tore the scattered ones apart. They stopped sharing intel. The digital network fractured into walled-off factions. Information became weaponized. Fear fed isolation, and isolation fed the entity. Because while the Fenwick descendants argued over what it wanted, the whispering ones continued watching, and they were no longer whispering alone. The purpose of endurance. The phrase has echoed through this story like a mantra: the bloodline endures. But the question that has haunted every generation of Fenwicks, and now perhaps the rest of humanity, is why? What has the bloodline endured for? Not merely to survive, not merely to suffer, to transform. In the wake of the ghastly journal transmission, more descendants came forward, marked and unmarked, young and old. Across the world they began finding one another, not just online, but drawn together in person by a compulsion they couldn't explain. Strangers approached each other in libraries, airports, and parks, speaking the same dream-scripted phrases. Some carried journals they had never read. Some wept upon meeting others with the same crescent birthmark, as if remembering a reunion long overdue. And still the dreams intensified. They became instructional teaching, not just words, but movements, symbols, even forms of geometry that existed only in four-dimensional logic. The marked children began working together without prompt or coordination to draw maps of places that do not exist in this world. Places, they say, will exist. One child in Prague painted a mural overnight that matched the dream of a boy in Cape Town, down to the curve of a shadow no one could recognize. These connections weren't coincidental. They were networked, synced like cells in a growing organism. The restorationists began calling it the ascension pattern. The communionists called it the becoming. Even among the severance faction, some began to waver, whispering behind closed doors that perhaps annihilation had never been the goal. That maybe endurance had always been the price of preparation. Because the bloodline wasn't just meant to survive the entity. It was meant to become it. Or perhaps more truthfully, host it. Through the eyes of the marked. Those closest to the phenomenon, the children born after 2010, have become its clearest voices. Not in declarations or ideology, but in what they do. They see things others cannot. Some describe light as too loud, or emotions as shapes that talk. They speak of threads that connect people of wounds in time of questions that ask back. They manipulate matter, subtly bending shadow, causing temperature shifts, interfering with machines, not through hacking, but through thought. But perhaps most disturbingly, they seem to remember things they haven't lived, as if memory now belongs not to individuals, but to the entire lineage. They call themselves by many names: the Echoborn, the Spiral Line, the Future Blood. They don't fear the entity, they identify with it. And when asked directly what it wants, one boy in Brazil answered, to go home, and to take us with it. That answer has terrified and fascinated everyone who's heard it, because it raises a final possibility that the entity is not from some hellish dimension, nor an ancient curse, but an exile. And the Fenwick bloodline, its arc. The door opens. In the final footage appended to the ghastly journal episode, time-stamped, corrupted, and reportedly deleted from servers without any human action, a child appears. She stands at the center of what looks like the ruins of Ravenscraftoft, though vegetation and geometry suggest it no longer exists in the same physical space. Around her are other children, some familiar, others, not all marked. She speaks. The veil is not torn, it is lifted. The door is not broken. It is opened from within. Then a pause. You have watched long enough. The camera trembles, the screen goes black. But in the final frame, hidden in the shadows of a corrupted pixel grid, a message is embedded. It has no font, no language, only shape and light. It translates loosely to, "It's your turn to choose." Today, the descendants of Ambrose and Eleanor Fenwick, those who still walk among us, are waiting. Not with fear, but with certainty. They are not scattered anymore. They are not hiding, and the door, wherever it is no longer locked. The bloodline endures, but now for the first time in centuries it does not endure alone. It calls, and somewhere something watches back. This has been the Ghastly Journal. If you're still here, check your neck, check your dreams, and if you hear the whispers in the dark, know that you've already been marked.